Need some new Commander cards? Well, you can pre-order Commander Legends now from our amazing sponsor, Card Kingdom. Just head on over to cardkingdom.com. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as SaffronOlive, and it's time for another daily dose of Commander Legends spoilers. The weekend is over, we have reached week 2 of Commander Legends spoilers, and oh my god, do we have a lot of cards to talk about today, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Commander Legends cards, and we're kicking things off with one of my favorite cards from the entire set, Hans Eriksson, who people say might look a little bit like me, hang on, let's see. See? Exactly like me, apparently. So, Hans Eriksson, a 4-mana Gruul legend. You get a 1/4 legendary human scout. Whenever it attacks, it reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature, you put it into play tapped and attacking, and it fights Hans Eriksson. Otherwise, you put that card into your hand. So when it attacks, worst case, you draw a card. Best case, you put some massive creature into play tapped and attacking. So this card, it's important for a couple of reasons. One is, it is one of the most flavorful cards from all of Commander Legends. It finishes a story that is being told all the way since Ice Age. For 20-some years, this story has been being told. So, Hans Eriksson is the brother of Safi Eriksdottir, and then they both kind of got by the Lurgoyf. If you look at Lurgoyf, it has some Safi Eriksson flavor tech. Akon's run, it's the Lurgoyf. So the Lurgoyf, they're out hanging out in the woods or whatever. The Lurgoyf attacks. Safi ends up dying. Hans, on the other hand, is just enjoying the beautiful day, smelling the flowers, oblivious to the danger, and then we even have Akon's Run as an unset card. So the flavor of this card is sweet. You can even see Safi in the background, apparently looking at the Lurgoyf that's attacking, while Hans is just in his own world, smelling the flowers, enjoying the beauty of life. So the flavor of Hans is sweet. As far as actually playing with Hans, the biggest thing I think you have to do to build a deck around Hans is try to make sure that it doesn't die when you put a creature into play. That's a drawback. Like, Hans, if you attack with it once, put something big into play, and it dies to the fighting ability, it's okay, but it's not super exciting. On the other hand, if you could use Darksteel Plate to make Hans indestructible, maybe a Vigor to actually grow it when it's dealt damage, or things like Dolmen's Gate, Bubble Matrix, stuff that prevents damage to creatures, then Hans gets insane. You can start just slamming big things into play every single turn, either just crossing your fingers, trusting the magic gods, or with a little bit of work, playing stuff like Worldly Tutor, Sensei's Divining Top, Scroll Rack. You can actually just control what's on the top of your deck and make sure that every turn when you attack with Hans, you're dumping a massive creature into play, which is actually a ridiculous amount of value for a 4-mana legend. I mean, hasting it in, even better. So I really like Hans, and not just because it kind of looks like me. It's actually a super sweet card, and I think it's a powerful card. Yes, you do got to build around it a little bit. If you just run this out randomly, it is going to die to the fight mechanic very often, but it's Gruul card draw, and if you can build around it and set up the top of your deck and make Hans indestructible or prevent the damage, it is a really strong commander to build your deck around. Next on our list, we have a pretty absurd green sorcery, Reshape the Earth. So Reshape the Earth, 9 mana, the green member of the 9 mana mythic sorcery cycle. Search your library for up to 10 lands, put them on the battlefield tab. So, in some sense, this is one of the most powerful land tutors slash ramp spells, sort of, that was ever been printed. Like, getting any 10 lands is absurd. Maybe the easiest way to think about this is Escape Shift that costs a lot more mana, but doesn't require you to sack lands. Like, if you get up to 9 mana and resolve this, you get any 10 lands. It's not basic lands, any restriction like that, which opens up some really sweet combo potential with Reshape the Earth. So let's say you Reshape the Earth, you can get like Valakut, Field of the Dead, and a bunch of mountains, and make a bunch of zombies, deal a bunch of Valakut damage. That is pretty absurd. One thing I did want to point out about this combo, because it's not obviously clear, cards like Vesuva, at first glance you think, oh, this is going to be sweet, I'll get Valakut, I'll get Vesuva to copy the Valakut, or Field of the Dead, whatever, but that doesn't actually work if you get things like Vesuva, which copy something when they enter the battlefield, you have to copy a land that was already on the battlefield before Reshape the Earth. You can't copy one of the lands that you find with Reshape the Earth. So keep that in mind with the Vesuva plan. Doesn't actually work out as well as you think. I mean, obviously, if you're playing Valakut in Field of the Dead, you're probably going to have Vesuva in your deck, but don't plan on getting a Vesuva and copying the Valakut that you tutored with the Reshape the Earth. You'd have to have the Valakut on the battlefield first, or Field of the Dead on the battlefield first, and then get the Vesuva to copy it. You can also do some sweet things with gates. This is probably the most exciting part of Reshape the Earth, is it's pretty close to I win the game with a Maze's End gate deck. You can get 9 guild gates and Maze's End, and then all you gotta do is activate Maze's End one time to get the last guild gate to win the game with Maze's End. So if you want to try to take the Maze's End guild gate challenge, Reshape the Earth is built for that deck. It is so perfect for what that deck's trying to do. Can also just use it as a crazy ramp spell. Like, getting 10 lands is going to be crazy ramp anyway, but if you get Tron lands or Cabal Coffers and a bunch of swamps, you can get even more lands, like Cabal Coffers, herborg, and then any amount of random lands that you want. It's going to make such an absurd amount of mana. So it is a crazy ramp spell. It gets even better if you can untap the lands right away, which means like Amulet of Vigor or Archellos, the new sweet legendary turtle. If you're getting these lands and having them come into play untapped, it's kind of like a ritual. And if you're getting like the Cabal Coffers or Tron lands or other rampy lands like that, then it is actually an absurd ritual. You're probably going to be able to get 10 lands untapped and have those lands produce like 20 mana or something, which is pretty ridiculous. The one thing I want to make sure to say about this card, though, is please, for the love of God, don't count it as a ram spell. And I know that sounds weird because it is literally a ram spell. It is putting more lands on the battlefield. We're just talking about getting Cabal Coffers to make even a better ram spell. But what I mean by this, Reshape the Earth is like a finisher. If you're building your deck, think of it as a way to get that, like, Cabal Coffers, herborg, and then Torment of Hailfire for lethal, or a way to get your guild gates and set up the Maze's End kill, or Field of the Dead, and make a bunch of zombies for the win. It's a finisher rather than what you would normally think of as a ram spell. So when you're building your deck, please don't just take it and be like, oh, you know what, I'll cut my Rampant Growth and play Reshape the Earth, or cut Cultivate, or my Mana Rocks to play Reshape the Earth, because 9 mana is a lot. You're going to need your Rampant Growths and Cultivates to ever cast your Reshape the Earth. So don't trade out a cheap ram spell in your deck for Reshape the Earth. Instead, Reshape the Earth, I think the best way to think of it is as a finisher. Yes, it does ramp. It literally does ramp. So it is a ramp spell, but it's more of a finishing ram spell, where you're probably going to be getting a combination of lands that either wins you the game by themselves, like Valakut in Field of the Dead or Maze's End, or is going to make so much mana that you're able to win the game with a single spell. So think of it as a finisher. Don't take the cheap ramp spells out of your deck for Reshape the Earth, because you're never going to resolve Reshape the Earth if you cut your cheap ramp for it. But the card is really powerful. One of the most powerful land tutors we've ever seen. It's going to win games. It is really insane, and I really like it. We also got Rashaka Debaser, and this is a pretty interesting card. So 6 mana, 6/6 Cat Demon. When it attacks, put target creature from defending player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control, and you can encore it for 8. So on one hand, just casting Rashaka Debaser, I'm kind of meh. I don't think that's actually all that exciting to run it out, try to wait a turn, try to attack someone, try to reanimate one thing. On the other hand, the encore ability is really appealing to me. So if you are going to just try to cast Debaser, I think you definitely want to try to give it haste. It gets much better if you can put Greaves on it or a Swiftfoot Boots on it. But really, where I'm excited for this card is in graveyard decks, where rather than planning on casting it and then having it eventually die, and then encoring it, maybe you just like get it in your graveyard with self-mill, and then the end result is like an upgraded Black Primordial. When you encore it, you're going to get a copy of it for each of your opponents. So each of those are going to come in with haste. You're going to get to attack all of them. You're going to steal a creature from each of your opponent's graveyard, and maybe get in some damage, and since encore is coming from the graveyard, and you're not casting the spell, it's not actually counterable or anything, so I feel like that's the main home for this. I'm not actually that excited to cast it for 6 mana, but in a deck like Sidisi, Chader, Marin, graveyard-based decks, I think this is an insane card to get in your graveyard, encore, then you're getting a really powerful effect in an uncounterable way that can theoretically just win you the game. So in graveyard decks, I'm really high in Rashaka Debaser. On the other hand, just casting it in a normal deck, I think it's more medium than anything, but certainly a sweet card, and one of, I think, the best encore cards that we've seen so far. far. Next on our list, we have a sweet Simic uncommon legend, Emodi, Celebrant of Bounty. So 5 mana, 3/1. Naga Druid, it has Cascade, and then spells you cast with converted mana cost 6 or greater also have Cascade. So a new Cascade commander, not a busted Cascade commander, but a fine value play, coming down, cascading, curving into the 6 mana spell the next turn to get more Cascade. It's only a 3/1, so it does die to basically anything. But the thing I like about Emodi is that it's not that good. One of the biggest problems with Cascade commanders, which right now are Yidris and Maelstrom Wanderer, is they tend to be so strong that you, as soon as you reveal what commander you're playing, you're going to take heat. Your opponents are going to be trying to attack you, and rightly so, because they know if your commander gets going, it's just going to take over the game in one turn. Like a single Yidris attack with all your mana up to cast a bunch of spells in Cascade, that could just swing the game in your favor. Maelstrom Wanderer coming down for double Cascade, like that could just swing the game in your favor. Emodi, it's a Cascade commander that is fair, quote unquote, or fair enough that if you reveal this in your command zone when we sit down to play, I'm not immediately going to try to kill you like I would if you revealed a Yidris or a Maelstrom Wanderer. So in some ways, the fact that Emodi is powered down is actually kind of a big upside. Like, it's still a sweet Cascade spell. It can still do sweet things with a bunch of big creatures, but it's not so threatening that you're immediately going to become the archenemy at the table, which you likely will when you reveal Yidris or Maelstrom Wanderer. As far as what to pair this with, really kind of tough. It seems built to pair with Brynlin, since it also cares about 6 EMC cards, so that is one possibility. It's also really cute with Kadama of the Eastery, since Kadama the Eastery will keep triggering when you cascade into stuff. It also will trigger the cascade from Emodi, is right on curve with it, but that'll allow you to build a big board really quickly. You're getting extra cards from Cascade, and then putting extra permanents into play from your hand with Kadama's ability. That's going to allow you to go from basically not doing anything to having a huge board very, very fast. So I think those are the most easy partner pairs. So I really like Emodi. Again, I don't think it's busted. It's not Yidris, it's not Maelstrom Wanderer, but I view that as an upside because it's a Cascade commander that you can play and maybe actually live for a few turns and get to play a game of Magic rather than getting immediately taken out because your commander is so busted. We also got some oozes, and okay, so the oozes, they're not actually called Ooze Lord and Ooze Partner. We haven't got the official names yet. They were spoiled in Japanese, I believe, and no one's actually translated the names, apparently, as of this recording, but they are sweet cards. So Ooze Lord is a 4-mana 0/0 that gives all oozes you control +1/+1. So by itself, it's a 1/1, so it doesn't die when it comes into play. The bigger deal is at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control your commander, you get a copy of it. So if you have a commander out, you're just slowly going to make more Ooze Lords, until eventually they take over the game. We also got Ooze Partner, which is a legendary Ooze with Partner, a 6 mana 0/0 that comes into play with 5 counters. Whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So a sweet +1/+1 counter commander that also works well with oozes because oozes tend to work with the +1/+1 counter theme. So I feel like if you want to play Ooze Tribal, these cards are almost certainly going to be in your deck. Experiment Kraj, Amori are 2 good ways to play oozes. Oozes are mostly in green-black, a little bit in blue as well. So if you want to play Ooze Tribal, these are auto-includes in your deck, as some of the better oozes in Magic. On the other hand, they also can work well with Ooze Partner being your commander, with another maybe +1/+1 counter-themed partner, because oozes care a lot about +1/+1 counters. You got Ord Refuge, you got Biogenic Ooze, you got Consumptive Goo. So I feel like Ooze Partner does have sub-legitimacy as a commander, and Ooze Lord, it's just going to show up in essentially every Ooze deck. There's no reason not to play an Ooze Tribal. As far as what to partner Ooze Partner with, that's a little tough. We got another new uncommon partner that cares about +1/+1 counters, Igniter, which I guess is an option, although it doesn't really care about oozes. Rayan also plays on the +1/+1 counter theme, or you could just go on the value plan, like Thrasios, or some of the other older partners are just good cards in an absolute sense. Like drawing you a card, it's hard for them to be bad, so you can go oozes and then just have a generically good partner as your other commander. So I think these cards are sweet. My one quibble is, I really wish Ooze Lord didn't have the commander-specific decks, because in actual Ooze Lord, I know we got Biogenic Ooze, which is like a pseudo-lord, but an actual Ooze Lord is something that I think players would really enjoy in like Standard or in Modern, but because Ooze Lord refers specifically to commanders, it's very unlikely it'll ever be reprinted in a Standard set, or a set that makes it Modern legal, so I think that's a little bit of a miss, although it is certainly a good card for Ooze Commander decks, where you're just going to get a Lord every single turn if you can keep your stuff around. Ooze Partner, I think it's worse than like some of the other Ooze Lords, but the flexibility of being a partner, letting you pick your color combination essentially, and having some potential in just generic +1/+1 counter decks outside of actual Ooze Tribal does make it pretty interesting. We also got Plague Reaver, and I actually have no idea what to say about this card. This is a weird one. So 3 mana, 6/5 black beast. At the beginning of your end step, sacrifice each other creature you control. So pretty big drawback if it's under your control at your end step. The good news is you can discard 2 cards and sacrifice it, and you choose an opponent, and Plague Reaver is going to return to the battlefield under their control at the beginning of their next upkeep. So this card is just really, really weird. It's kind of like a chaos card. So I guess what you do with this is you play it, and you immediately have cards you want to discard, maybe to reanimate or for value, and then give it to someone else, and then that opponent is going to have to discard cards, or they're going to lose their entire board. So it kind of can be this weird, slow, janky Plague win that can die to removal. So I don't know. Like, I don't know what you do with this card. My guess is it's something you just play for fun. I don't think it's better than the other options available. It does gain a little bit of value as a discard outlet if you're playing a graveyard-based deck, some sort of reanimator-based deck, where you actively want to be discarding cards for value. So I think that's probably the home. Like, Tiny Bones commander decks probably really going to like Plague Reaver, because you're going to force your opponent to discard cards. So if you can get value out of it that way, I think it could be pretty good. As far as just playing it in a generic deck, though, I think you probably leave Plague Reaver on the sideline. It's just too weird for me to figure out. Maybe it's a lot better than I think, but it feels risky. If your hand gets wiped, you could be stuck sacrificing your creatures. Eventually, it's going to end up with a player who doesn't have many creatures, and then what do they care? They're not going to discard cards to it, because sure, sacrifice all my other creatures, or someone's just going to kill it because they don't want to get their board wrath. So I don't know how it's going to play in practice, but I think it's mostly limited to discard / reanimator style decks in Commander. We also got a pretty interesting removal spell, Pseudo-Wrath, token producer, Necrotic Hex. So Necrotic Hex, 7 mana, each player sacrifices 6 creatures, you get 6 2/2 tap zombie creature tokens. So Necrotic Hex, it's kind of like a weird Pseudo-Wrath, a bad damnation. I'm not even sure how to think of it as far as a removal spell, because it can be a little bit hit or miss depending on the board state, but essentially, let's call it a Wrath combined with a mini Army of the Damned, where you're going to get a bunch of zombies out of the deal. The good news is, because it's a sacrifice effect, it is a Wrath that gets rid of indestructible things like Ulamog and Heliod, if it's activated as a creature, of course, which is a nice upside. Sacrifice can be a nice upside. On the other hand, sacrifice can also be a downside, because remember, you're only getting 6 creatures, and if your opponent has 6 or less creatures, that's great. You actually just get a hard Wrath out of it. On the other hand, if you're up against some sort of go-wide token deck with Tristani, Race, Gaiard, anything like that, where your opponent's probably going to have a lot of 1/1s on the battlefield, there's a decent chance your Necrotic Hex against that deck is going to get like some 1/1 tokens, and your opponent's going to get to keep their best creatures. So that is the drawback, is it doesn't actually guarantee to kill everything. In some board states it will, but in other board states, against specific decks, it probably won't. Is this worth playing in your deck? And boy, that is tough to figure it out. The votes for Necrotic Hex are Ingaruk's Wake and Decree of Pain, are expensive Wraths with upside, and they both see a lot of play. Ingaruk's Wake gets rid of all your opponent's stuff, your stuff's fine. Decree of Pain gets rid of everything, you get to draw a bunch of cards. Necrotic Haze, I don't think is as good as either of those, because again, it's not a hard Wrath, even though getting rid of indestructible stuff is upside, and I think a bunch of 2/2s is probably worth in like drawing cards with Decree of Pain. Maybe a more right comparison would be something like Necromantic Selection or Reaver Demon, which are like like wraths that leave behind bodies in one way or another. Necrotic Hex is a little different. Both Necromantic Selection and Reaver Demon leave behind one big body. Necromantic Hex is going to leave behind a bunch of small bodies. Whether that's better or worse really depends on the board state. The problem is neither Necromantic Selection or Reaver Demon are really staples like Ingruk's Wake or Decree of Pain. So I think this is a card that is really good, but I'm expecting it to mostly see play in one specific type of deck, which is zombie decks. In zombie decks, you're going to get more value out of the 2/2 zombie creature tokens than most decks. In a zombie deck, then Necrotic Hex is actually super sweet because you're going to get a bunch of Odd Thief tribe members to benefit from lords and other synergies. So I think if you're playing any sort of zombie tribal deck, this is in the conversation over some of the other more expensive wraths in the format. On the other hand, in just a generic deck, I think you want to go with In Garruk's Wake, Decree of Pain, and I'm not even 100% sure that it's better than like Necromantic Selection or Reaver Demon in most playgroups. Again, if you're playing against a bunch of like indestructible stuff, and that's what your playgroup is like, it does go up in value. So a sweet card for zombie decks, and a potentially powerful removal spell, bad against tokens, good against indestructible stuffs. I guess weigh it based on your playgroup and what you're expecting to play against. But in the dark, unless I'm playing zombie tribal, I think there's other cards that I would rather have in my like wrath / expensive removal spell slot than Necrotic Hex, even though it is a sweet card. Next on our list, we have Nightshade Harvester, a pretty sweet black elf shaman. So 4 mana, you get a 2/2, but don't worry, it's not going to stay a 2/2 for long. And then whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, that player loses a life, and you put a +1/+1 counter on Nightshade Harvester. So what this means, let's say you run this out, and it goes once around the table, and each of your opponents just makes 1 land drop. No fetch lands, no shenanigans, 1 land drop. One time around the table, it'll be a 5/5. The next time, it'll be like an 8/8, and it's slowly draining your opponent as they play lands. Obviously, it's better against fetch lands, ram spells, etc., etc., etc. It's kind of like a mini polluted bonds on a body. It doesn't gain you life, which is a drawback, and it does die to creature removal, which is also a drawback, and it doesn't deal as much damage, but it is a creature that's going to get really big, which is a huge upside. I think the thing I like about this card is it's a good way to punish, but not punish severely, green ramp players. And I firmly believe that green ramp is arguably too good for Commander. You get such a big benefit having green in your deck because of cards like Cultivate, Kadama's Reach, and many others. Nature's Lore and Farseek and Rampant Growth and etc, 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 etc. All the green ramp spells are really, really busted. They don't die like artifact-based ramp. They're the reason to play green in Commander, one of the big reasons. Nightshade Harvester is good against those cards. If your opponent's putting extra lands into play, they're taking extra damage and growing your Nightshade Harvester more. But at the same time, it's certainly not game over. I would still cast my Cultivate with a Nightshade Harvester out. Like, it's a little annoying that I'm going to lose a life and grow your creature, but I'm still going to do it. So I like that this punishes the green ramp decks, but does it in a very gentle way. It's not like Opposition Agent, where it's like, hey, you just can't do this, I gotcha, sorry for building a green deck. This, on the other hand, is more like, I don't know, I'm going to ping you a little bit, I'm going to annoy you a little bit, I'm going to grow a creature, but it's not really that big of a deal. So Nightshade Harvester, I don't know. I guess if you're playing against a lot of green ramp decks, it's probably in the conversation. It does seem good there. Just running in a random deck, though, does it do enough? It's going to get big. It's going to slowly drain. But I'm not sure this is enough to really make me want to put it in most decks. We also got Rootweaver Druid. So, Rootweaver Druid, I don't know about this card. 3 mana, 2/1 Elf Druid. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent can search for 3 basic lands. They each put one of those cards into play tapped under your control, and then the rest go into play under their control. So essentially, you resolve a Rootweaver Druid. The end result most likely is going to be you get 3 basic lands from your opponents, and each of your opponents is going to get 2 basic lands. So that means you are coming out slightly ahead of your opponents, but really you're kind of ramping the entire table, and your benefit, like, is 1 extra land worth being the one that's spending 3 mana on Rootweaver Druid? So Rootweaver Druid, it's a little bit like Veteran Explorer, except it has an ETB trigger, and it kind of breaks the symmetry where you're going to end up with more lands. On the other hand, the biggest, hugest, most massive problem I have with Rootweaver Druid is it's a green card. And if you're playing green, like, why would you possibly want to give each of your opponents 2 lands for you to get 3 lands when you could just cultivate and, like, put yourself up a land and get another one in hand, so kind of 2 lands, and your opponent's up 0 lands, it doesn't seem better to me than any of the other green ramp spells. But there is an exception. Maybe you're playing a group hug deck. If you're playing a group hug deck, and the theme and gimmick of your deck is you're going to help all your opponents, but maybe help yourself a little bit more, then Rootweaver Druid is perfect. Is it as good as Cultivate as far as like win percentage and improving your odds of like actually being the last person standing in a game of Commander? Almost certainly no. However, if your theme is, I'm helping everyone, and try to get political favors out of it, with Feldegriff or Kenrith or something like that, then I think Rootweaver Druid is definitely in the conversation in your ramp slot, and is probably even better than Cultivate or Kadama's Reach, not because it's a more powerful card, but because it's going to be more in flavor with what your deck's trying to do in the group hug theme of your deck. So, Rootweaver Druid, bad in generic green decks because there's just so many green ramp options. This is helping your opponents almost as much as helping you, and I don't think you want to help your opponents with most decks, but a great ramp spell for group hug decks where helping your opponents is actually the theme of your deck and what you're trying to do. So not good for most decks, but in very specific decks, Rootweaver Druid seems like an auto-include. Next on our list, we have a super sweet zombie wizard legend, Nevinyrral Herborg's Tyrant. So, obviously, a callback to Nevinyrral's Disc. We've had that in Magic for a long time. We've never had Nevinyrral itself. So, 6 mana Esper legendary zombie wizard to get a 3/6 with hexproof from artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. Kind of a weird set of protection. When it enters a battlefield, create a 2/2 tapped zombie creature token for each creature that died. Not even you control, just any creature that died. And then when Nevinyrral dies, you can pay 1, and when you do, you destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. So, Nevinyrral, obviously, the protection, I don't know how good that is. I guess it means it can't get, like, Meteor Golem, or Ravenous Chupacabra, or Banishing Light, but it still gets Swords, and Path, and Wrath, and all that kind of stuff. So, is that actually helpful? I guess slightly, but it's not a very strong form of protection. More exciting with Nevinyrral is it's an obvious callback to Nevinyrral's Disc. Like, it does the same thing. When it dies, you can pay 1 and do exactly what Nevinyrral's Disc does, and that kind of fuels itself. That's kind of the sweetest part of this card. It combos with this, and it combos with itself. So let's say you got a decent amount of mana, you have your Nevinyrral dies, maybe you sacrifice it or whatever, blow up everything, hopefully including a bunch of creatures, then you can just use your mana to cast Nevinyrral from your command zone and make a whole bunch of zombies. Combo's even easier with Nevinyrral's Disc. Like, you just play Disc, and then for 1 mana you wrath everything, and then use 6 mana to cast Nevinyrral to make a whole bunch of zombie tokens. So I think even just by itself, it's a pretty powerful controlling commander. It's a repeatable wrath that also builds you a big board. The other thing I like about this card is it is a sweet aristocrat-style commander. Like, play your Blood Artists, Azulaport Cutthroats, and Woe Striders, sacrifice your board, kill some of your opponent's stuff, and then Nevinyrral to get a bunch of zombies, which you can then sacrifice to get even more drain with your Blood Artist. And if you want to, you can actually do pretty much all this in a zombie deck. I think that's the sweetest part of Nevinyrral, is this is like zombie aristocrat commander, and that's something we haven't really had before. Even though we have a lot of good zombie aristocrat pieces like Diagraph Captain and Plague Belcher, they're essentially zombie Blood Artists. Then you have like Undead Augur and Midnight Reaper is payoffs for sacrificing stuff, drawing you a ton of cards, churning you through your deck. You have Carrion Feeder to Tusco Husk is cheap sack outlets, and if you want to, there's even really easy ways to go infinite with this. Like, the easiest way is just Gravecrawler plus Phyrexian Altar and another zombie. That allows you to cast Gravecrawler an infinite number of times. You sacrifice it to make a black mana, then you recast it from your graveyard, then you sacrifice it to make a black mana. Well, each of those Gravecrawlers, even though it's the same creature, it's a new creature as far as the rules are concerned. So this allows you to make infinite tokens with Nevinyrral. I guess it's not truly infinite because you're going to have to stop at some point, but you know what I'm saying. Like, sacrifice Gravecrawler a million times to Phyrexian Altar, then just cast your Nevinyrral, then you have a million zombie tokens, which hopefully wins a game, and maybe your opponent deals with it. Guess what? You do it again the next turn, because Gravecrawler Gravecrawler comes back from the graveyard, and Nevinyrral goes back to your command zone. So even if your opponent has an answer to this, like a Wrath, you just combo off again the next turn, play another zombie, Gravecrawler a million times, make a million more zombies with Nevinyrral. So I think this is actually a really powerful commander. It's a sweet card by itself, is like this weird pseudo Nevinyrral's Dis/Wrath. It's a sweet aristocrat commander, and it's an especially sweet zombie combo aristocrat commander, which is super exciting. This is the kind of zombie deck I want to play. Like, yeah, just beating down with zombies is fine, whatever, but zombie sacrifice is such a sweet archetype. Nevinyrral is the perfect, absolutely perfect commander for that archetype. It's got all three main zombie colors. It's got the right sacrifice colors. Oh, it's such a super sweet card. Next up, we move from the world of zombies to the world of elves with Abomination of Llanowar, a pretty interesting, uncommon Elvish horror legend. So 3 mana in the Golgari colors. You get a star, but actually its power and toughness are equal to the number of elves you control plus the number of elves in your graveyard, and it has vigilance and menace. So Abomination of Llanowar, this thing can get really, really big. And I think it does 2 different things. First off, if you're playing a green-black elf style deck, maybe like Nath Elves, Risa Exiled Elves, maybe some sort of like weird Azoni elf deck, I think Abomination of Llanowar, you're going to play it in your deck because it's often going to be just a massive, massive threat. It's 3 mana like 10-10 or 20-20. Speaking of 3 mana 10-10 or 20-20, I also think this makes it a pretty interesting green-black Voltron elf commander. Like, you play this as your commander, then you use some sort of protection, Lightning Greaves, Canopy Colors, Canopy Cover, maybe Whisper Silk Cloak, so you know you can get in attacks with your Abomination of Llanowar, and it's protected from removal, and then you just make a bunch of elves. Elves are really good at going wide. That's like elves things. That's what they do. So you have like Leslana Huntmaster to make an elf token whenever you cast a spell. You have Hunting Triad to make a bunch of elves. Then you have Elvish Promenade to essentially double up your elves. It should be pretty easy to build an Abomination of Llanowar where you just one-shot someone, and even if your opponent manages to wrath your board, you're still going to get the pump for your elves in your graveyard, which makes it easier to rebuild. So if you want to play a very different style elves deck, and I love that about this card. Like, in general, elves are like, go wide and then Crater Hoof to overrun and kill you that way, or literal overrun to overrun and kill you that way. Abomination of Llanowar, while it does fit in go wide elf decks, it also lets you play this go wide like Voltron style deck, where because you're going wide, because that's what elves do, you can also one-shot people with your commander, which is super, super sweet. So a really interesting new take on an elf legend, good in the 99 of other green-black elf commanders just because it's big, and a sweet Voltron build-around commander. Speaking of sweet elves, we also got Elvish Dreadlord, a pretty interesting wrathy elf. So 5 mana 3/3 Death Touch zombie elf. When it dies, non-elf creatures get -3/-3 until undeterred. However, you can encore it for 7, and that's, again, the big payoff for this card. When you encore it, you're going to get 3 Elvish Dreadlords, 1 for each of your opponents, and they're going to sacrifice themselves at the end of turn, so that means at the end of your turn when you encore this, unless something goes horribly wrong, like your opponent has a Swords to Plowshares or something, which even that's not that great because it's going to die anyway, but that's going to mean everything gets -9/-9. It's very close to a hard wrath in most games of Commander. So obviously, Elvish Dreadlord, it's at its best in some sort of green-black elf deck. We talked about Reese, we talked about Abomination of Llanowar. In an elf deck, this is a like build your own Plague Wind because your elves are not going to get the -3/-3 or the -9/-9 once you encore it. So it's kind of a one-sided board wrath in an elf deck. On the other hand, I think you could just play this in a graveyard deck as a graveyard-based wrath. Like you mill it over with Sidisi or whatever, Buried Alive it in your Marin deck or Madrotha it into the graveyard somehow, and then you encore it and wrath the board. Sure, your stuff's gonna die too, I mean, unless some of it's incidentally an elf, but that's fine. It's a wrath you can play from your graveyard, which kind of makes it like this weird Bane of the Living or Toxic Deluge, with the -X actually being an upside because it gets around Hexproof, it gets around Indestructible, it gets around all these forms of protection that some other wraths can't deal with. So Elvish Dreadlord, I think this is just a good card. While it is at its best in a green-black elf deck, I think that just graveyard decks will play this as well, where it has a powerful encore ability as a wrath that you can just dredge or mill into your graveyard, get back in the late game, sweep away the board, reset everything, and then what do you care if your stuff dies? You're the graveyard deck, so you're going to be getting your stuff back out of the graveyard anyway. So great in green-black elves, and just a really good card for graveyard decks. We also got Flamekin Herald, just a red 3-drop that makes it so your commander spells have Cascade. In general, I haven't found much success with cards that only do something when you play your commander or only benefit your commander. So personally, I'm pretty skeptical of this. It might partly be because I don't cast my commander that much, so maybe that's why I never have success with cards like this. I mean, getting some extra value out of casting your commander, it is nice. Cascade is a powerful ability. Is it worth having this in your deck? I don't know, although I will say, we have seen a ton of cards refer to commanders lately, giving different abilities, hexproof and menace, and all this stuff. There's a bunch of these cards now, so in theory you can build like Commander Tribal if you want to, especially with a partner pair, so you have multiple commanders, so maybe it would be fine in something like that, but in general, I don't think Flamekin Herald offers enough value that I would just play it in a generic deck. We also got a couple of sweet uncommon legends. Juri, Master of the Revue, a 2-mana, 1/1 legendary human shaman. When you sack a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So, Juri, I mean, it's pretty straightforward what you want to do with this card. You play it like a Mayhem's Devils style deck, an Aristocrat Sacrifice deck, with your Furnace Celebrations, and Mayhem Devils, and Blood Artists, and you do a bunch of sacrificing, and you make it big, and then you sacrifice it and deal damage at your opponent's face, maybe just kill them on the spot. Also kind of cute with pump spells, like Juri, and then Hatred it, and then sacrifice it. Could potentially take out 2 people if you can get an attack in between. Also works really well with mass sacrifice. Stuff like Gatatura Rabatu, Shimatsu the Blood Cloaked. They allow you to sack any number of permanents, so while it can be risky to like sacrifice all your lands, all your other creatures, this can make Juri really big enough that maybe you just sacrifice it to a Woe Strider or something and 40 your opponent's face, or at least do enough damage to kill your opponent. So I think there is some commander potential for Juri. Also really sweet in a treasure token deck. That is one of my favorite ways to play this card, I think, as a commander, because treasure tokens, you can make them repeatedly with stuff like Revelant Riches, Dockside Extortionist, and then they sacrifice for free as you make mana, so it's going to grow your Juri really bigly. So if you want to go rack those treasures, I think Juri is a sneakily good commander there. So while I'm a little bit medium on Juri's commander potential, I do think it's an easy inclusion in the 99 of sacrifice decks. Like if you're playing Korvold, why wouldn't you want Juri? He's like this powerful creature, going to grow really big, going to benefit as you're sacrificing stuff, deal some damage, seems like an easy inclusion there. So some amount of commander potential. My favorite choice, I think, is the treasure token plan. I think that in specific really benefits Juri. On the other hand, another really good card just to stick into the 99 of sacrifice decks. We also got our exclusive FTD Goldfish preview card. Thanks to Wizards for hooking us up. Amori of the Dead Tide. So Amori, pretty interesting Encore legend. 3-mana, 1/4 Dimir colors, Merfolk Wizard. Tap it, exile cards from your graveyard, equal number of opponents you have. So 3 cards most commonly. And then target creature in your graveyard gains Encore until end of turn with its Encore cost equal to its mana cost Encore. Really powerful mechanic, actually. You exile the creature from your graveyard and get a copy of it for each opponent you have with haste is sacrificed at the end of turn, but that is fine. You can do some crazy things with this card. So Tomer just did a whole spoiler video, so I'm not going to go super in-depth on Amori. You can check out Tomer's video. Hopefully I'll pop up a card somewhere if I actually remember, which I may or may not, but I might remember. Otherwise, I'll link it in the description for sure. So check out Tomer's video. But I think you just play this with big Reanimator stuff. Like, imagine something like Garuda, or the Black Primordial, or Rude's Cardemon, or Scholar of the Lost Tropes. You Amori, and you're going to get a copy for each opponent. Can you imagine 3 Garudas coming into play? Or 3 Primordials, each of which can steal a creature from each opponent's graveyard? That means a single Primordial coming into play could be 12 creatures. You steal all your opponent's creatures, and you get the Primordials for a turn. Or Scholar of the Lost Trope to reanimate a bunch of stuff, or tutor 3 times with Rude's Cardemon. So with cards like this, Amori's really scary. It just scales so well to Commander. It looks like kind of a janky reanimation card, but really it does so much more because you're reanimating X3 if you have a full Commander table. It reminds me a little bit of Sedaris with the Unearth ability, except it scales so much more effectively. Like getting 3 copies instead of 1 is so much better, but the same tricks as Sedaris, like Sundial to Infinite works. Like normally Amori is going to make you sacrifice the creatures at the end of turn, but if you can end your turn with the sacrifice trigger on the stack, you get to keep the creatures forever, which is even more busted. So apart from being a sweet build around Commander, I think it's also just a good card to play in graveyard decks. Like maybe you're playing Sedaris, maybe you're playing Sidisi, even Scion of the Erdreg, and kind of hilarious tutoring dragons into your graveyard, becoming copies of them, and then putting them back into play with your Amori. That seems super amazing. So I like it as a commander. I like it in the 99. Amori is just a super sweet card. So check out Tober's video breaking it all down, but I really like it. And thanks again to Wizards for hooking us up with a super sweet legend to show off for you. Finally today, in the world of lower rarity cards and reprints, we talked briefly about Nader, being a kind of interesting elf / +1/+1 counter commander. Nader's Nightblade, it's basically a blood artist, but only for tokens. Not exactly sure why you would play it over an actual blood artist, but I guess you can, maybe for flavor purposes. Couple other uncommon legends that aren't super exciting, although Itch Tactic is actually a pretty interesting Golem commander if you want to play like all the splicers from Scars of Mirrodin block that make Golem tokens. This could be a interesting way to take advantage of those. Repart Rise, no crazy high value slam dunks today, but a lot of like couple dollar common and uncommons that everyone's gonna need in their collections. Swiftfoot Boots, Thought Vessel, Ultra Staples, Boros Charm, very good index of its colors. Kadama's Reach, if you're green, you play it every time. Generous Gift, good white removal. Nev's Disc, a good colorless sweeper. So even though these are mostly like $2 cards or whatever, not $50 or $100 cards, they are cards that every commander player is going to need in their collection. And rather than having to go out and buy them, probably multiple copies, because like every deck you're going to play, or many of the decks you'll play, you're going to want like a Swiftfoot Boots, for example. Rather than going and buying them for a couple of bucks, which is going to add up, you crack some packs, get them for free as a bonus for opening Commander Legends. So good reprints, even if they're not super high value. Otherwise, a bunch more edge foils, some partners, Ramos, Karametra, more gods entering the mix. And then finally, just a bunch of lower rarity stuff, which mostly good for limited. Factor Fiction, kind of a sweet reprint, more diamonds, Coiling Oracle with extended border. And that, I believe, brings us to the end of our daily Commander Legends spoilers for today. So, good God, so many cards to talk about. What do you think about all these sweet new cards? How good are the new legends? What about the green mythic that puts 10 lands into play? How busted is that? Is that a ramp spell or not? What about Rootweaver druid? Is wrapping everyone worth it? Nevinyrral, how sweet is our new zombie aristocrat commander? What do you want to build around it? Abomination of Llanowar, our one-shot elf Voltron commander, Elvish dreadlord, the other encore stuff, our exclusive gold preview from Wizards. What do you think about that? What can we encore to play? What's the scariest thing to get 3 copies of from your graveyard? Necrotic Hex, can that be a playable Wrath? What about Emodi? Is that a good enough Cascade commander that's still not so scary that you're going to die immediately? All the other stuff as well. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'll be back tomorrow with more Commander Legends spoilers. Until then, have a amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.